Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. It's been a long time since we painted some Hive Fleet Kraken on the channel. One of my goals for 2024 was to revisit the color scheme, but I was juggling so many different projects it ended up getting pushed aside. We just wrapped up our end of the year challenge over on our Discord server, and it was all about finishing up a goal we set earlier in the year. So I figured now would be the perfect time for Hive Fleet Kraken to leap back into the spotlight. I made a few changes to the color recipes, which I think both saves time and looks a little better than the original scheme. And make sure you stick around to the end of the video too. We'll be showcasing the challenge entries from our Discord members. So with all that being said, let's grab our brushes and get started. After assembling the model, I primed it with gray primer, followed by a heavy spray of white from the top and sides with my airbrush. In the previous videos I sprayed the models with Wraithbone spray, which you could do if you want to. I've switched over to this method and I like it a lot more. I'm also painting the model in a few sub-assemblies, which I attached to corks with paper clips. If I wasn't filming a video, I'd be more inclined to paint the model fully assembled, but it'll be much easier to see everything if I paint a few of the parts separately. Let's start off by painting the skin with a mix of 2 parts contrast medium and 1 part skeleton horde. This is a slight change from my previous videos, where the skeleton horde wasn't diluted. Diluting the paint this way should save us some time later, because we won't need to do as much highlighting. When working with contrast paints, I like to work on one section at a time. Apply plenty of paint so it flows into all the recesses, and then use the brush to soak up any excess paint as needed, paying special attention to the recesses. I like to soak up extra paint on the raised areas as well, and make sure the finish is as smooth and as even as I can make it. With the skin base coated, I noticed a few of the shadows aren't as dark as I'd like. So I used a fine brush and painted some undiluted skeleton horde directly into the deepest recesses. Now it's time to use the old favorite, Magos purple, and add some color to the skin. Blending the paint is really easy. Just paint a small section, rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to blend the edge of the paint. If the paint is drying too fast and you're having trouble blending it, you can try lightly wetting the surface first. Use a damp brush with very little water, and lightly dampen the area where you want the blend to be. Then apply the paint and blend. Now is a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. After the first layer dried, I painted a couple more to deepen the color. Next, I base coated a few different areas with pink horror. The tentacles on the face, most of the joints, and the undersides of the big claws. After the first layer dried, I painted a second layer for an even finish. After the pink dried, I shaded all those areas with Magos purple. I'd like the tentacles to have a blended effect, so I shaded the bottom half of each with a second layer of Magos purple. And then I shaded the bottom third with a layer of Nuln oil. Next, it's time to use one of the channel's other favorite colors, a mix of 3 parts Flesh Terror's red and 1 part Black Templar. It's been a long time since I painted some Tyranids, but because I mixed a whole pot of this color, I know this model will match all the rest that I painted. On some areas, I like to use 2 brushes. First, I'll paint as much as I can with a larger brush, in this case a number 2. Then I got a sharp number 1 and painted the edge of the scales where they meet up with the skin. Some of the scales look a little uneven, and that happens sometimes when painting a dark, transparent color over a very light base. I thinned down the mix with some water, about 1 part water to 2 parts paint, and with very little paint on the brush, I smoothed out any uneven areas with a glaze. The key here is to have very little paint on the brush. We don't want it to run and flow anywhere. We just want it to tint the surface a little bit and darken those bright spots. The Leviathan model on the box has a dark blended effect on the claws, and I think that would look great on this model. I thinned some Black Templar contrast paint with an equal amount of water and painted some along the edge of the claw. Then I rinsed the brush, wiped it on a paper towel, and blended the edge. Up to this point I wasn't entirely sure how I'd paint this skirt thing, which I'm just going to call a cape. I think I'd like to go with purple, blended to a really dark purple at the bottom, almost black, pretty similar to the box art. Daemonette hide will provide a good base coat for the next layers. Then I shaded the purple areas with Magos purple. There are a few different ways I can darken the bottom of the cape, and in the interest of limiting the number of colors used in this guide, I decided on mixing some Black Templar into Magos purple. I mixed 1 part Black Templar to 2 parts Magos purple. The final color is very close to shyish purple contrast paint, but it's not nearly as strong, and I think that's a good thing. Weaker paints tend to be easier to blend. Since these areas are larger, I'm wetting the area to be blended first. Just a small amount of water from a damp brush is enough. Make sure the surface isn't too saturated, and then add some paint to the bottom half, rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and use the clean brush to blend out the edge. As the paint settles on the model, it'll collect and pool in some areas more than others, so make sure to go back and soak up any excess paint as needed. I'd like to deepen the color some more, so once that first layer dried, I painted a second layer on the bottom of the cape. I'm not wetting those areas first this time, but you could if you want to. Next I painted all the claws and spikes with black. In the previous videos I made some different mixes with contrast paint, and you could do that instead if you like. I painted the remaining details with toxic yellow. And then I shaded them with Gryph-Hound orange. At this stage you could assemble and base the model and call it finished, but I'd like to add some highlights, so let's keep going. First I'm going to touch up the skin with Bonewhite and smooth out any uneven areas with a glaze. I got pretty smooth results from the initial base coat, so I didn't end up needing to do much glazing. There were a few areas that needed to be touched up, around the orange gills and where some of the Magos purple in the joints spilled over. Next I highlighted the edges of the skin with Offwhite. I'm using a mix of glazing and edge highlights. Where and how much of each highlight you use comes down to stylistic choice. You might want very few edge highlights, or you might want to paint a lot of them. I tend to put an edge highlight anywhere that the sculpting is sharp and well defined, and I tend to put softer glaze highlights where the detail is less pronounced. On any areas where the skin blends to purple, I gradually faded out the highlight. I'll mix a light pink to highlight those parts later. Let's move on to the pink areas next, beginning with Pink Horror. First I painted a glaze on the bright pink areas. For the most part, this highlight is a lot like the Bonewhite highlight earlier. I'm mainly focusing on smoothing out any uneven areas. Then I painted a few edges on the darker purple sections, the ends of the cape spines, and the top sections of the face tentacles. On the blended areas, there will come a point where the pink is too dark or it looks out of place, and that's where I'll end the highlight. Next, let's mix up a lighter pink with about 1 part Offwhite to 2 parts pink. I highlighted most of the same areas as before, but this time making the lines more narrow and focusing them on the sharpest edges. Finally, I mixed one more light pink color, about 3 parts Offwhite to 1 part pink, and I painted it on the sharpest edges and corners. This mix was also light enough to highlight some of the purple tinted skin, like around the feet and face. Let's highlight the scales next, starting with Evil Sunz Scarlet. I like to highlight along all the sculpted edges and grooves, and then add a few extra lines of my own. I think it's a good idea to thin the paint with a small amount of water, and the lines will be semi-transparent. Then I can go back and paint a second layer to build up the color. The scales might be too dark in some areas, and it's really easy to brighten it up with a glaze. Thin the paint with even more water, about 2 parts water to 1 part paint, and with barely any paint on the brush, apply the glaze to the areas you want to lighten. Notice how there's barely any paint going on the model, and it dries very quickly. Build up a few layers until you're happy with the results. I'd like the claw highlights to have a faded effect, so I concentrated the red highlights along the center and gradually faded the lines into the dark side. Next, I highlighted the scales one more time with a bright orange. I like to make the highlights very narrow and place one inside each of the red lines I added in the last step. The amount of orange you paint depends on personal taste, and there are a lot of variables that will affect the end result. The width of each highlight, length, how diluted the paint is, and if you paint a second layer or not. Do some experimenting and see what kind of effect you like. With all the scales done, let's tackle the purple next. I highlighted the bottom edges and a few of the vertical creases with Phoenician purple. I'd like the bottom of it to stay really dark, so I'm trying to avoid overdoing them. Next, I highlighted the purple with Daemonette hide, focusing most of the highlights near the top, but I did add a few to the bottom as well. I also tried to avoid highlighting the center portion. This color won't show up very much near the top, but it will really stand out against the dark lower section, so make sure the lower highlights are very sharp and narrow. If you make any mistakes, you can correct it with Phoenician purple mixed with some black paint. I mixed some Offwhite with the purple, about equal parts, and highlighted the cape one more time, focusing on just the top sections. Now for the claws, beginning with a highlight of Incubi Darkness. I picked out all the edges with a wide highlight. Incubi Darkness is pretty transparent, and as a result it looks really dark after it dries. It's even harder to see the difference on camera. Despite that, it's very important for setting up the next highlight colors. I also painted highlights on the sides of the big claws, and just like with the red highlights, I'm trying to emphasize one side in order to create a blended look. I also painted a glaze of Incubi Darkness on the ends of the larger claws. It's not completely necessary, but I think it adds visual interest to the larger surface area. Next, I highlighted the claws with Thunderhawk blue. This is also a very transparent color, so in order to make it more opaque, I like adding a tiny bit of Fenrisian gray to it. I'm making these lines more narrow than the Incubi Darkness highlights, and I'm trying to have them sit inside each one. So basically there's a Thunderhawk blue line with very thin Incubi Darkness lines on both sides of it. I highlighted the claws one more time with Fenrisian gray. This color is a pretty big jump up in value, so it's important to make these highlights as narrow as possible, and restrict them to the sharpest edges and corners. Finally, I highlighted the eyes and the gills with toxic yellow. I removed the pins from the parts, assembled the model with superglue, and then attached it to the painted base. I'll be releasing a video next week about how I painted the base, and if you're watching in the future, I'll include a link to that video here. We had some great submissions for our end of the year challenge. It was all about finishing up a goal or a project. Crazy Viking Boy painted this awesome looking Norn emissary. He got into Warhammer less than a year ago and worked really hard developing this custom color scheme, and I think it works really well. I really love the color choices. Sometimes life gets in the way, but that didn't stop Fluffy David from converting and painting this Archon, inspired by the Cabal of the Flayed Skull from the 9th edition Codex. I think it's a great conversion and very clean and neat painting as well. Lawbro's goal was to make a Blood Axe's war boss, and this conversion is based off an Auric war chanter from Age of Sigmar. What a cool, unique conversion. The camo patterns are a nice, extra sneaky detail too. Pitlord painted up this Battletech quick draw model in a desert scheme. As someone who lives in the desert, I love the color choices. Great blending, and I love the base too. Having the scene in the background is a really cool effect. The model just blends right in. Saturn utilized contrast paints and weathering effects and painted an amazing looking Skaven army. The army looks very cohesive, no doubt because of the great color choices and the basing. Sebastian's goal was realistic skin, and his Gotrek model turned out awesome. Really nice job on the tattoos as well. They're very finely detailed and they have a natural look. All the other areas are painted well too. Good color choices, and everything's neat and clean. It comes as no surprise that Plays for Daves was the crowd favorite with his Old World Chaos Army, led by none other than Sigvald with a very impressive chrome shield. The purple and yellow color scheme works so well, and the colors are all balanced. I love how the gold armor has some purple shadows in it too. Really amazing work from everyone. Thank you all for sharing, and if you'd like to participate in the next challenge, come join our Discord server. We'll be starting a New Year challenge soon. I'd like to give a big shout out to our channel members. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a huge help. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below. Thank you. It felt good to revisit this color scheme, and I wish I would have done it sooner. Sometimes we have so many projects going on at once, it can be easy to push things aside and forget about them. Are there any projects you haven't worked on in a while? Forgotten about? Or maybe you've been avoiding or neglecting them? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.